AnthonySalloum, Rideau Institute. Tell me what you heard in the lockup.
Well, there was a lot of expenditures listed down. It's like a shopping list of expenditures on part of the government. I think the main concern is whether there's any sort of a coherent strategy behind the nature of the expenditures. Some of the concerns on the front end, as far as I can tell, having just sort of come out of the lockup, is that I don't think they invested enough in infrastructure spending over the next 2 years. The money's spread over a 2-year period, and it's really dependent on the capacity of the provinces to meet the funding, because it's all contingent on 50-50 with the provinces. And so the first thought you have is that if the weaker provinces that don't have the fiscal capacity to spend can't match the funds, then we have an instant challenge in that infrastructure spending isn't going to necessarily be available. Now, the government has promised to look at that, but there's some concern. There's also some concern in how fast that money can flow to create jobs. The area of greatest concern is the $20 billion over the next 6 years in personal income tax cuts. Economists after economists has said that tax cuts in times of recession is not the way to create jobs, that there's a greater proportion of job creation per expenditure if you actually invest, if you spend money as a government, as opposed to cutting taxes. So we're a little perplexed in why the government would invest so much money into tax cuts at a time when they really should be creating jobs. I mean, that is what economists have said across the country. So I think the government has some explaining to do on why it's investing so much in tax cuts at this point in time. There's very little money in terms of help for students in this country. You know, you would think one of the ways to increase competitiveness would be to actually increase transfer payments to provinces to help students with their debt, help them go into university and learn to compete in this global economy. But there isn't a dime for universities to help lower tuition, for example, or to books. And so that's an area I think when we're talking about competitiveness and jobs in the future, I think is severely lacking for government. There isn't a word in there about increased spending, for example, for international aid, because the global crisis is hitting countries like Africa and third world countries even harder. So it would have been nice for the government to show that it doesn't just care about Canadian citizens, but that it cares about those that are less disadvantaged as well. So we do expect the usual 8% increase in ODA that they've planned, but frankly it would have been nice for the government to show some gesture that we're part of the global community and that we're looking at those that are even less disadvantaged than Canadians. So that's a quick summary of where we're at. There's some very good expenditure numbers in there, for example, for via rail, to improve rail, for example, and to increase rail safety, for example. So there's little tidbits in there that are very good. But we're also concerned in terms of whether the government is going to eliminate or reduce environmental assessment, for example, on some infrastructure projects. So there's some concern in how the government's going to streamline some of its infrastructure spending. So that's a quick wrap-up of what the budget looks like right at this point, having just come out of the room.
One of the concerns I've heard is that infrastructure spending is tied to partnership with municipalities. That could be a real blockage as well.
At sort of first blush, I think it's 50-50 with the provinces. However, the government has set aside some money as well to speed up some municipal infrastructure investments. In other words, money at low interest that municipalities can borrow from to spend on much needed infrastructure programs that aren't necessarily part of the provincial priorities. So the government has set aside some money, but those are loans. Those are not direct expenditures, and the municipalities would be expected to pay those back. But there is some money there.
Right. And P3s, how do they figure into the...
Well, this is very interesting. You can tell the government's very sensitive to the concerns Canadians have with P3 infrastructure. From what I was able to see, I didn't see a single reference to P3. So you can tell the government has been very, very, very nuanced in how it scripted its budget and how it described its planned expenditures. So there was no direct reference to P3s, which is, from my perspective, from the Rideau Institute's perspective, very good, because we're very concerned about that. But there's a constant reference to public investment and public infrastructure investment. So we hope the government, when it says public, it means public. But we'll wait and see on that.
One last question.
Sure.
Much infrastructure-related employment is in male-dominated professions. Is there money in this budget that's going to go into women's employment?
Well, not at first blush, and that's an excellent point you raised. But I must say that there was a significant amount of money in there for reinvestments in social housing, for example, and improvements to social housing, building new social housing units. And as we know, a significant portion of the poor in this country are single parents, most of whom women. So there's indirect help for them in terms of there may be additional social housing units being developed in this country for them, but there is not that I can find, anything in there that specifically targeted women in the employment stream. So while there is money for example, an extra 5 weeks of benefits in the EI benefits, for example, or extra money in there to train workers who have been out of the workforce for extended periods of time, or those that are been in the workforce for a long time but can't need retraining in order to stay in the workforce because they're too young for retirement. So in some ways those will benefit women, but it's not targeted, which means for the most part, for example, in the infrastructure money that's going to go into infrastructure projects, that will not directly benefit women. And so you're absolutely right to raise that as a concern. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't fall in their favor.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
My pleasure.